The Rough Patch, written and illustrated by Brian Lees. Evan, avid gardener, and yes, anthropomorphized fox in a society of anthropomorphized foxes, does everything with his best friend, his dog. Until one day, completely unexpectedly, his dog dies. After burying him in the garden, he soon chops the whole thing to bits and throws it away. He then allows it to be completely taken over by weeds, until he makes it the saddest and most desolate spot he can make it. One day he notices a pumpkin vine growing up into his yard from next door. Rather than chop it off immediately as had become his habit, he lets it grow until it's once again time for the county fair. Once he gets to the fair, he really seems to cheer up. He samples all of the familiar delights, sees some old friends, and places third in the pumpkin growing contest. Third place wins either $10 or a new puppy. And at first Evan says, yeah, I'll take the $10. Then he says, can't hurt just to look. Losing any friend, whether human or animal, is really hard. Lees in this book really gets at the erratic process of grief. The sudden shock that often ushers it in, our anger turning both into destruction and the cultivation of our own desolation, and the isolation of all of that. He's further encouraging the reader to allow beautiful things to grow as they arrive. Evan doesn't plant the pumpkin, he simply doesn't cut it off. He chooses not to follow his recent habit. Evan slowly allows old cues that used to give him life to lead him back to it. And in reconnecting to his own joy, he is finally able to, rather unexpectedly, bring more joy into his life with the new puppy. I don't know what's harder in the human struggle. The cultivation of our own despair when something goes horrifically wrong, or the permission for new possibility to grow within us in place of the devastation. Frankly, in the midst of it, expanding until our base condition is no longer the despair we held so dear. When I scheduled this video several weeks ago, I had no idea that we were about to lose our best friend of 14 years, our family dog, Humphrey. I wanted to share that because this really gets at what I've been trying to say with short form literature. I could have read a novel about grief or a self-help book about it. I've certainly done both and certainly will do so again. But instead, in this case, a 5-minute read through helped me process some things, called my attention to where I am, acknowledged the great loss that Humphrey truly is to me and to a lot of mine. Do not underestimate short form literature, particularly the kind that comes with pictures. These forms have a way of accessing us in ways that longer forms do not. A book like this can be one short step in a longer journey, or an open door, and either can lead to a revolution or a revelation inside. The picture is always bigger. When I think of a storybook author who still writes for children with just a tiny bit of a dark edge, I think of Lucy Cummins. Author, illustrator, and executive art director for Simon & Schuster's books for young readers. Lucy Cummins has a dual knack. One, for creating illustrations to accompany the work of other authors that reads a little bit sweeter than her own, and for creating her own work with just a touch of the macabre, just a little bit less sweet in the midst of all things adorable. Her visual style is so unique that I can't quite put it into one hard and fast category. She incorporates a scribbly technique that is more or less refined depending on the project, often less refined in her own project and a little more refined for other people. And in her own book, she tends to have just the tiniest splash of the wonderfully gothic nonsense of Edward Gorey. She doesn't write or draw scary, but she creates whimsical and just damn cute illustrations that, again, especially in her own work, often bring just the tiniest little bit of danger. In Vampenguin, her latest solo book, Cummins depicts the Dracula family going on a trip to the zoo. Unbeknownst to the rest of the crew, for the length of the trip, baby Dracula switches places with someone who looks just a little bit similar. I have two especially favorite things about this book. First of all, that big switcheroo is not reflected in the text at all. It's simply told in the illustrations, like this one, in the aviary. Shh. My other favorite thing is that Cummins, who clearly is the mother to a couple of small children, quintessentially captures the experience of being at a zoo or any kind of theme park situation as an adult. And she does it through a pitch-perfect use of understatement and irony, such as this short wait in line, or the absolute delight of the entire Dracula family with the seal performance. Or, as seen in my personal favorite spread of pages, outdoors the Draculas first saw the tiger, then the elephants, then the monkeys, and then finally, the lion. When this book dropped last year, and incidentally, this is a signed copy, bonus penguin! I was so completely enthralled with Cummins that I ordered another book that we didn't have in stock, A Hungry Lion, or A Dwindling Assortment of Animals. The book starts with a healthy long list of animals present, and then hold on, a few less, even less, so much less. And this time, that's where I'm going to stop, because this book is what you think it is, but it's not what you think it is, but it might be what you think it is, but I don't know if it's what you think it is. You're just going to have to go get it. And now for another couple of wonderful books that Cummins illustrated but did not write. I picked up Carter Higgins' This Is Not a Valentine recently, and I just love this little book. Spoiler alert, I am a sucker for Valentine's Day. However, the child in this book specifies that every single gift they give to their sweetheart, not a Valentine. My favorite gift given is the superhero cape, because red is pretty good for superheroes, and you're my favorite one. One thing that Cummins does with the illustration of this book that I really love, again, most of it is done in her signature style, which is slightly scribbly, although as you can see, a little more cleaned up, a little more dear. However, all of the objects that are extended as gifts are done in a really different style. These more realistic illustrations are created with gouache, that is a kind of watercolor, juxtaposed against the charcoal and marker used in the rest of the book. And last but not least, we have Sylvie. This is her second collaboration with the author Jan Reedy, the first of which is called Truman, about a turtle who just might have a little bit of a cameo in this book. If any of you have a soft spot for Charlotte's Web like I do, you too will probably fall in love with this book on sight. Sylvie spends most of her time hanging out somewhere where she cannot be seen. She has picked up on the fact that unfortunately a lot of people are not really thrilled to see her. But from a distance, she has in a way adopted 4 little humans that live in the building, keeping watch over them day and night. She sends all the kids her love and allows them to see her crawling up to the top of the building until they all converge, meet, and create a whole little community of their own, including Sylvie. Cummins is one of those all too rare finds. She just has a way of accessing adult humor in kids' clothing. An author-illustrator creating for children who is willing to bring her own distinct micro-macabre humor to a book in a way that only an adult writing for other adults could do. Personally, I'm not sure she isn't stealthily writing for adults. Lucy Cummins, if you're watching, I love you. And could you please do some books for adults? We'd love it. Really, I don't care who you're making books for, just please keep making them. Keep illustrating other people's books, but also please keep writing yours. Yours are the best. Remember, gang, the picture is always bigger. Welcome back to The Big Picture. I've decided that Wednesdays are going to be theory days. What do I mean by theory days? There are a lot of different issues, ideas, and assumptions that projects like mine are uncovering. Interestingly enough, I am not the only one doing it. Although we are pretty rare, but working with picture books the way that I have and the way that I do made me ask a very interesting question. Who is a reader? It started when I was a bookseller at the inimitable Chaucer's Books in Santa Barbara, still the greatest children's department that I know within a general bookstore, and arguably the greatest general bookstore I have found. And trust me, I've been hunting. When you work with a lot of parents in a children's section, you're going to come across 2 big stereotypes and a bunch of things in between. My child is a reader. They can't stop reading. I need more books. Hand me all the books. Or my child is not a reader. They've only read this or that. They refuse to read much. They only read comic books. They only read Pokemon, etc. Who is a reader? Who gets to be a reader? Who do other people consider to be a reader? If we look at popular culture, that tends to mean people who read long-form fiction. Period. That might seem like a pretty extreme statement to make, and yes, I am possibly slightly overstating that assumption, but really not by much. Almost every single meme that has to do with reading has to do with, I got lost in a book, I love this fantasy series, I love this mystery. There is nothing wrong with long-form fiction. I do read long-form fiction, although it is not my usual choice. But it's interesting because within that bias, there come several other assumptions. People who read short form are not readers. People who read nonfiction are not readers unless they also read fiction. If you're interested in information or self-evaluation or poetry, then you're not a reader. Readers can spend time in the general fiction section, the sci-fi fantasy section, the mystery or romance section. Any trips to those aisles that are not long-form fiction in the bookstore are side pursuits, not what they really read. Readers do not read books with pictures. This is why this has come up so much for me. When was the last time you heard someone who reads graphic novels described as a reader? Or even a collector of art books? Who decided that? We have the assumption that a reader is someone who constantly reads, who can't get enough of reading. We could argue maybe that person is a big reader or a prolific reader or a passionate reader, but anybody who reads at any time is a reader. People who only read periodicals or even articles found in web form at this point are still readers. Why does this matter? I think it matters because every reader deserves to be respected no matter what they read. I believe that anybody who wants to identify as a reader can identify as one. Again, the number of times that I have heard novel reader versus graphic novel reader juxtaposed as if one is really a reader and the other, well, that's not really reading. That's just not true. Not only do all of these genres need to be respected, and the readers that read these genres need to be respected, but frankly, the intellectual lives of those people who read need to be respected. And speaking of intellectual life, it's also worth talking about, at least in cursory form, how the Academy views a reader. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today exploring the ins and outs of specific theories within academic discourse on reading. My brother happens to be an academic that studies how people read and how people have read in the past, so hey bro. But what I want to talk about is the attitude that many people receive from the Academy, that a reader reads things of substance. And books of substance are, for the most part, things that are agreed upon by the group. That becomes interesting when you learn the history of the Western Academy when it comes to literature. There is something called the canon. Within the canon, there are certain agreed upon things that are great books. However, across time and for various reasons, things enter the canon and fade from the canon. For example, my brother is a literature professor who happens to be an early Americanist, and he spent a lot of his time a few years ago arguing that Longfellow, one of the early American poets that we all read in school, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and The Song of Hiawatha, should be included in the canon of American literature as important. He has started to become excluded over the last few decades from the canon because he's not important enough. And by that, the Academy often means something that was created in a popular style, something that is accessible to children. Apparently, a lot of people forget that Shakespeare wrote in the popular style of his day. Anyhow, the Academy obviously at this point does not just look at the classics, they do look at contemporary literature. But what corners of contemporary literature get attention in the academic field? I have several friends who have PhDs in topics within popular culture, and it is notoriously harder for them to find work to be heard within journals and symposiums. The Academy does not give a ton of respect to the notion of reading for pleasure if that reading is not particularly challenging to the mind. I wanted to bring up those notions of popular public assumption and the Academy because I think that we often have both things warring within us without even knowing it. And I think it's really important to affirm ourselves as readers and to affirm each other as readers. So if the majority of stuff you consume happens to be romance novels, groovy! There's nothing wrong with that. Take your mind for a ride. I hope it's a good ride. If you are any age and your books look kind of like this, you are awesome! If you are obsessed with a series like Outlander or Lord of the Rings and every single book is this big, you go! That's rad! And if this is the kind of thing that floods your shelves, rock those pages! If you're into steampunk western microfiction, dude, send that to me. So really, my big takeaways are this. 1. Everyone who reads is a reader. Period. 2. Respect the intellectual life of the person reading whatever they're reading and how it might stimulate them. 3. Respect the relaxation of the individual reader next to you. And 4th, maybe you should think about taking a walk to another aisle. Try something you haven't read before, and I don't just mean an author you haven't read before, although that's also great. Try reading a genre you've never tried. See what happens. Maybe include some pictures in that book. I'm just saying. Just a thought. Because remember, the picture is always bigger. Death Wins a Goldfish by Brian Rea. Before he became a full-time fine artist and illustrator, Rea used to work for the New York Times, but you can still find him in the Times. He regularly contributes illustrations to their amazing Modern Love column. If you haven't read this column, you really should check it out. It's quite something. Death receives a letter from HR. He's never taken a single day off and therefore has about a year of leave that he needs to take, and he needs to take it starting Friday. The rest of the book is a journal of his year off. First, he gets acclimated, tries to learn the art of conversation. He's never had to use it before. But in March, something awesome happens. He goes to the carnival, and there, Death wins the goldfish. He's really into the goldfish. One of my favorite little touches about this book is that the goldfish disappears for pages and pages and pages, and then you'll suddenly see this, or this. But Death also tries a lot of human things, like dating. It doesn't really go well. However, his snow globe collection game is strong. He takes some trips, just like any of the rest of us might take. Ends up in an excellent discussion about scythe technique, runs into an old colleague, and even the occasional past client. But again, like the rest of us, as much as he's trying to make the most of his year, he has plenty of time for ennui, as well as creativity. When his year off is through, all of his colleagues seem really happy to see him, and he's pretty happy to see them too. Note, he brought a new friend. And as he says at the end, he's definitely going to spend his time from now on living. Such a silly book, right? No. But yes. But no. This rather diminutive picture book has a rather long foreword, complete with footnotes, about how this project came to be. Ria shares that his early workaholism as an art director only gave way to a career in which he can stop and breathe now and again, due to the advice of his father on the day of his retirement. He asked him, "Dad, if you had advice for your 30-year-old self, what would you say?" And his dad, who had always said quite the opposite, thought for a moment and said, "Work less." This book is about living. It's about taking up all of the wonderful goodness and boredom and experimentation and quietude and the connections that happen when we stop and breathe and chill. It's also worth noting that this is the first book in the life of this particular channel that is a picture book written for an adult audience. There's some decent innuendo, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And the subject is a lot funnier for adults who, perhaps, feel much closer to death than their kids do. I'm hoping that books like this become more and more common. Well-wrought, wryly funny, softly wise picture books with an adult audience in mind. Because the picture is always bigger. Banksy by Stefano Antonelli and Gianluca Marziani. I'm a huge fan of Banksy. I'm a big fan of the street art movements around the world over the last 20 years. Frankly, I have said a million times, as an artist, I would have been a street artist if I were able to run. For those of you not familiar with the notion of a street art movement, it refers to artists that started using the city as their canvas. Graffiti artists had done this forever, and graffiti artists can be considered part of the street artist movement. There's a lot of overlap. Rather than waiting for galleries to grant them legitimacy, artists like Banksy simply made their work public. The first important thing to know about Banksy, if you don't know about Banksy, is that no one knows who Banksy is. Over the last 25 years, there's been a lot of conjecture. Some people have claimed to have found tax records or other financials that point to certain people, but none of that has yet broken the case. Because not gonna lie, Home Dude would probably be in jail for a really long time, considering a lot of the stunts he's pulled, although that one was technically legal. There are certain people in the British government that still want to arrest him for this caper in 2004. He printed £1 million worth of these fake banknotes with Diana as the queen on them. They were tossed around in certain festivals and some people tried to spend them. Let's just say they're still less than thrilled. Banksy is an anti-capitalist anarchist. He is never afraid to share his opinion, whether political. These are from the Israeli wall in the West Bank. Or ecological. Banksy confronts us with a lot, but some of it is simply meant to be delightfully invasive. Rats doing all sorts of things are one of his primary iconographies. I mean, dude really loves rats. And ridiculous pop culture spoofs. Girl with Balloon is arguably his most iconic single image. Even a lot of people who don't know the name Banksy would have seen a reproduction of this image somewhere. It has been ripped off and sold ruthlessly all over the place. Which leads to an interesting point. Even though Banksy has successfully remained anonymous for his 25-year career, he does sell legitimized paintings. He has always worked out of his hometown of Bristol. We know that much. He used to leave a car full of art in a garage in Bristol, call his agent, tell him which garage it was in, and say, go and get it. He has also put on a lot of shows over the years, mostly in warehouses turned galleries. The guy certainly has no problem selling, and by the mid-2010s was doing perfectly fine in the big auction houses. Do you remember that girl with the balloon? He put an original stencil of this up for auction at Sotheby's in a rather substantial frame. It sold for just over £1 million, and as soon as it sold, somebody hit a button and the paper shredder inside shredded half the piece. In 2021, that same piece, half shredded, sold for £25 million. Banksy thinks the game of big sales for big art is absolutely stupid, and he plays it extremely well. Personally, my favorite of all of his ventures has got to be Dismaland. He basically created a minor Disneyland in the UK, but of a more disastrous variety. Of a more warped variety. Kind of demented. I remember hearing that the caricature artist stand had all of the people facing away from the viewer. Man, did I want to go to Dismaland. This particular compendium of Banksy's work is excellent. It was just published this last spring by the wonderful Italian publisher Rizzoli. They do things other than art books, but their art books are absolutely grand. This is not the biggest art book in the world, but it is so well curated that it definitely serves as a great overview of his career. And its sourcing is so recent that it actually even includes his coronavirus lockdown work. You guessed it, rats at home. The authors have created a reasonably thorough, yet also concise text to go along with the images. It really is kind of the perfect balance I look for in an art book. I don't necessarily need long essays, although long essays can be very helpful to many collectors. Here we have some essays, but we have some really interesting features, like the end has a Q&A that I really like. Banksy is an artistic voice that stands outside of culture and yet has now defined much of it. Only in his continued anonymity is he still able to do both. I only get to paint murals with permission because, you know, the running thing. But he chose to work in a fast medium so he could jump in and out of a space and suddenly have something appear. He is the sort of Robin Hood of art. And also, as an artist whose work is regularly vandalized or destroyed, he is the equivalent to a sand mandala in the fine art world. Unlike a lot of other famous street artists who have left the streets for the gallery and who are making projects aimed more towards permanence than impermanence, Banksy has always understood destruction as creation. He expects his stuff to be messed with. He expects his stuff to be painted over. It could be some random graffiti artist. It could be the local street cleaners. I think that he understands that art is prophetic. And prophets don't simply tell the future. They speak the truth of the present to the people around them. While it's not the only thing that art can do, it is something that art does exceptionally well. Remember, the picture is always bigger, sometimes even bigger than a wall.